Okay, thanks. Սպասենք մի րոպե մարդիկ միանան եւ սկսենք, լավ։
Լավ։
Հիմա ես partager écran, share screen անեմ թե ոչ։
Առայժմ
Երբ ուզում եք։
Պարոն Donabédian, պրոֆեսոր, դուք ձեր վիդեոն եւ մայկրոֆոն mute արեք, գայանեն կսկսի, հետո դուք կսկսեք։
Շատ լավ։
Շնորհակալություն։ Գայանե, կարծում եմ կարելի է սկսել, արդեն բավականին մասնակիցներ ունենք միացած, շնորհակալություն։
Okay։ Ասիր, երբ միացած է, ես կսկսեմ։
Հուսամ, որ այդ
Միացած ենք,
կստացվի, երբ կարողանեմ շնորհ։
կարող եք սկսել։
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm very happy to announce that this is the first webinar organized by ROCHEMP office, Regional Office for Cultural Heritage, Management and Protection. This office is the result of the international collaboration between the Italian Agency for Development Cooperation, the Ministry of Culture of Armenia, and the University of Bologna, alma mater. There will be, we hope, many other similar webinars. I really am thankful. I really thank Professor Patrick Donabédian, that is an expert that I really respect very much. He's Associate Professor of Armenian Studies at the University of Aix-en-Provence of Aix-en-Marseille. From 2009 to 2016, he had been the director of the multidisciplinary archaeological investigation of Ererouyk basilica and archaeological site. So he's now the best expert on the world about this monument. The occasion to have a conference of this monument. Hello? I heard a sort of echo, sorry. And the occasion is given by the fact that on May 21, the Ministry of Culture of Armenia and the government took a decision to support the preservation of this wonderful and precious monument. And also this monument...
Sorry.
Yes?
Professor Donabédian, could you please off your microphone? Because there is an echo and we cannot understand what is happening.
You mean close the microphone?
You should close it until you speak. And the occasion is given by the fact that on May 21, the Ministry of Culture...
Okay, thank you, please.
Okay, sorry for the little technical problem. As we have said, this is our first webinar ever, so we need a sort of exercise to be more professional. The Ererouyk monument is a very important and unique monument in Armenia, and has been object of interest from many different organizations. In 2016, it has been listed in the 7 most endangered monuments of Europe by Europa Nostra and the European Investment Bank Institute. And they are still working and supporting each action that is aimed to the preservation and the enhancement of these precious monuments. So we hope to have in the future other possibilities to have conferences and to present you the results of the further steps for this project. Now I have the pleasure to pass the floor to Professor Donabédian, that will illustrate all the characteristics and the history of the basilica. You are allowed to make questions on the chat of the Zoom, and after the speech we can have a space for questions and answers. Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor, again for accepting our invitation.
Professor, the word is yours. Please start. Thank you.
Can you see my presentation?
We can see you, but not your presentation.
Okay. Here on my screen, it's written that you have disconnected the share of screen.
Please try again.
Yes. Is it okay now?
Yes.
And do you see it in a full screen?
No, we don't see it in a full screen.
And now?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so it's a pleasure and an honor to make this presentation today before such a large audience, I understand. And it is, of course, a honor to know that the Armenian government has taken this very important decision concerning the preservation and the valorization of this very important archaeological site and very precious, as Mrs. Kasnati said, precious monument, Ererouyk. Ererouyk, as you know, is situated on the northwestern extremity of the Republic of Armenia, on the border with Turkey, 45 kilometers southwest of the regional capital, Gyumri. The complex includes the vestiges of several buildings, among which an early Christian basilica, another building, a small building in the valley, which is perhaps a mausoleum, the remains of an alleged rampart or enclosure, and a series of parallel walls corresponding at a certain period to a dam, 2 underground halls, and numerous fragments of sculpted stones, as well as the ruins of a village, apparently modern, but probably of late antique and medieval origin. So one of the purposes of our archaeological expedition was to try to better understand the reasons of the presence of such a large ensemble of ruins in a space which is now poor and deprived of water. Another objective was to try to clarify the absolute and relative dating of the main buildings, as well as the function of many of them, which was unclear. The mission also sought to specify the relationship which existed in the past between the religious complex and its human and natural surroundings, as well as the link it must have had with the medieval capital Ani, from which it is only some kilometers away. Of course, a special attention was paid to the basilica. It is indeed, despite its very ruined state, one of the most impressive vestiges of Armenian architecture. Architecture of the 1st century of Christianity. The building was submitted to studies of history of art and architecture, building archaeology, and classic archaeology. The Building Archaeology Survey has highlighted, beyond obvious signs of repairs and adjustments beyond superficial differences in the color and treatment of the walls, a clear homogeneity of conception. This last observation led us to consider the entire building as the product of a single main construction campaign. Comparative studies of architecture and sculpted decoration, on which I cannot expand here, have shown that the church, belonging to the group of nave basilicas without cupola, can be dated approximately to the 6th century. In any case, it must be placed before the end of the 6th century, a moment from which begins a new page in the history of Armenian architecture, that of the reign of the dome on cruciform or radiant compositions, with a very specific decorative language totally absent from ERERUYK. These studies have also revealed that the basilica had close relations with the early Christian monuments of Syria. This relationship is particularly clear in the presence of the two prominent angular chambers which flank the western facade of Ererouyk, and to a lesser extent in the presence of the two laterally elongated sacristies or pastophoria of the eastern angles. Here you can see some examples of Syrian churches with the same principle of two prominent chambers at the corners of the west facade of the church, high chambers which make them resemble towers. And here I attract your attention to the eastern part of the Ererouyk Basilica, with the eastern pastophoria, which are elongated but laterally elongated, as you see on the plan and on the reconstruction. You can compare here with Syrian basilicas, where you find the same feature, pastophoria, or let's say sacristies, which are laterally elongated to the east church from both sides of the apse. On this plate, I wanted to show you Armenian churches of the same early Christian period, with again the same type of elongated, laterally elongated pastophoria, but very narrow. And this is interesting because it seems to be proper to Armenia. Simultaneously, you have a feature of kinship with Syria, and something very specific to Armenia. The affinity with is also notable in the sculpted decoration of the basilica, especially the horizontal strips along the facades and the moldings that border the windows on all their height before folding into small horizontal wings. Last, here you can compare Ererouyk with Kalblose, which is a very famous basilica in Syria. Lastly, this kinship is patent in the field of epigraphy. A Greek inscription carved on the eastern extremity of the south facade of Ererouyk is very close, both by its content and by the form of its frame, to the one carved on the same part of a Syrian monument, Deir Seman Church, a monument of the end of the 5th century. The same frame and the same content. Unfortunately, on this picture from the Syrian church, you can't see the inscription, but you see the frame, which is the same. The form is the same. Two archaeological surveys were carried out under parts of the floor of the basilica, the Ererouyk basilica, of course, where the absence of paving allowed it. We were authorized, because there was no paving in this part of the building, of the monument. We were also authorized to dig under the floor. One of these investigations concerned the floor of the basilica's main nave in the south half of the apsidal zone, and especially in its southeast part. The window thus opened into the basilica's underground allowed important observations. First, we found no trace of a previous construction prior to the present basilica. With other clues, this observation helps to invalidate an opinion which is logical, of course, and quite understandable, the opinion according to which any early Christian Armenian church is necessarily built on the ruins of a pagan temple. Here there's, as you can see, no trace of nothing before, under the foundation of the church, of the present church. Second, the foundations of the apsis wall and of the southeast angle of the basilica's nave were brought to light, as you can see here, and studied. Under the walls, and only precisely under the walls, we could see 3 courses of stones laid on the rock without mortar. The stones of the lowest course were totally rough. Those of the highest rather well squared. This confirmed the tradition of a rather light system of foundations, as observed in some other monuments of early Christian and medieval Armenian architecture. This survey also revealed that since the walls of the building, their light foundations, are resting directly on the bedrock, there is no platform, no real crepidoma under the construction. This is important for our apprehension of the 5 or 6 steps that surround and seem to precede the basilica. It allows us to understand that the impression of a building resting on a crepidoma, which this device creates, is a false one. It is, in fact, an imitation of crepidoma. Here I want to show you 2 other examples of very important Armenian churches of the early Christian period and the golden age of the 7th century, where we find again the same very important crepidoma under the church. The first one is Tekor, from the end of the 5th century. And the second one is the famous Cathedral of Zwartnots of the middle of the 7th century. Here, the platform is very large in Zwartnots. And what is common to these three monuments is the function. All of them they are memorial and very important memorial monuments devoted to important saints, and probably monuments, churches in which the relics saints were kept. Another archaeological investigation was carried out under the floor of the southwestern angular chamber of the basilica. Here you see the southwest chamber. Here again, the investigation revealed that there was no pre-Christian layer and no underground structure as it was supposed. It was supposed, there was such an assumption because of the presence of a baptismal basin under the floor of the southwestern chamber in the Syrian church of Dei Solaib, a monument which can be dated to the second half of the 5th century, and which is typologically close to Ererouyk Basilica. So here also we were authorized to dig under the floor because the floor was damaged in this part of the monument. And so we found, we couldn't find anything previous, prior to the basilica. But on the other hand, the dig we made under the floor revealed an episode which was unknown in the history of the basilica. Our excavation showed that a fire damaged the original paving, imposing the installation of a second, rougher floor. And thanks to the radiocarbon analysis of fragments of charcoal found there, the fire could be dated between the 8th and 10th century. Here I brought the picture of this very important inscription because it gives us important information concerning the history of the monument, of the basilica, and also its status, or let's say its function, and also important information concerning the whole site. So let's have a look at the text of this inscription, which is engraved inside the basilica, and it says that you can see in Armenian and in English that a certain priest Hakop came from Karakudasht. Karakudasht is a name for Varashapat, or let's say Echmiadzin. So this Hakop priest came to this village and this Saint Martyrium for the intercession of the true believers in Christ. And he says that he has restored it in the name of the precursor and the proto-martyr. So here we have very important indications. First, the fact that the church is called Martyrium, and second, that it was devoted to two very important saints. The precursor is Saint John the Baptist, and the proto-martyr is Saint Stephen. This allows us to understand very important features proper to our basilica. For example, the fact that it is huge, it is built on this imitation of crepidoma, and it was a martyrial, as we said, a martyrial sanctuary, exceptional, like Tekor and Zwartnots. On these pictures, you can see also another unusual feature which we find on the facades of Ererouyk. This kind of pillars engaged in the facades, and pillars which do not play any architectonical role, but they serve only to rhythm, to give a certain rhythm to the facade, and perhaps to strengthen it to a certain extent. Here on this picture, you can compare one of the portals of the Basilica of Ererouyk with the one we have in Avan near Yerevan. And the importance of this comparison is that Avan is precisely dated to the end of the 6th century. So this also gives us an element of dating for our basilica before, as I said, before the end of the 6th century. Again, concerning the basilica, our expedition made an attempt of hypothetical reconstruction of the elevation of the church. And as you can see on this picture, it shows a 2-story covering with a saddleback roof on the main nave and 2 pent roofs on the lateral naves, simultaneously covering also the galleries. The choice of such a solution is justified by the fact that the roofs descending from the lateral naves had to pass over the high apses niches situated at the eastern end of the north and south galleries. Here, for example, you can see the north and south galleries with those apses niches at their eastern extremity. As for the engaged pillars, or let's say pilasters, inserted in the lateral facades of the basilica, they may leave the impression of having supported a roof, but in reality, they played, as I said already, no role in the covering of the galleries. And the imposts, or let's say the capitals placed on them, deprived of any trace of mortar on their upper surface, have never supported anything. These engaged pillars served rather as element of decoration and perhaps to a lesser extent of reinforcement. Our attempt of reconstruction also shows the protruding and high chambers on the corners, which I mentioned already. But what can seem particularly unusual is the north-south incline of the roofs of the eastern pastophoria. This curious incline of the 2 angular roofs, lower towards the exterior, higher towards the nave, is obviously imposed by the incline of the vault, partly preserved on the 2nd level of the northeast pastophorium. Here also you can see this very unusual incline of the second, because these angular sacristies had, and this one still has, two levels of vault, two vaults, one on top of the other. The first one is horizontal, and the second one has this inclination, this incline, which is quite strange, very unusual. As for the lateral galleries, a careful measuring of the preserved elements, especially the first springer of the eastern arch, from both sides, southeast and northeast. Careful measuring has allowed to hypothetically reconstruct the external colonnades with 6 columns from the south for the south gallery, and perhaps 6 or 7 for the north one. The western facade underwent a modification which occurred perhaps soon after the main building campaign, probably as a consequence of the collapse of the galleries or of a subsidence of the rock platform under the west side of the building. Then a new portico was added, as you can see, leaned against the facade, much lower than the original one, and this time the portico was vaulted. It seems possible to imagine that above this vaulted gallery, a kind of balcony has been laid out, as could be seen on many contemporary Syrian basilicas. Now let's go to a little bit to the south of the basilica, and let's have a look at the memorial zone. Since the first campaign, the zone lying to the south and partly to the east of the basilica has attracted our attention due to the presence of fragments of sarcophagi and to the unusual high number of remains of stepped pedestals. Pedestals which once supported stelas or columns topped by a cross. Here you can see the remains of these pedestals as we found them when we first visited the basilica. And here you can see them after cleaning of this part of the territory. And here you can compare with an attempt of reconstitution. I don't know what is the right word, not reconstruction, but recreation of this type of monuments, which has been done in Gogaran. So you can have an idea of the original appearance of this type of monuments, with a pedestal, a base, and a stela or a column, and on it a capital, and on the capital a stone cross. On other sites of this period, of this early Christian period, the number of such monuments, which are relatively frequent in early Christian Armenia and Georgia, doesn't exceed 1 or 2, except in Artsk, Gogaran, here for example, and Kassar, where the remains of 3 or 4 pedestals and stelas of this type can be seen. In Ererouyk, from 6 to 8 of them stood on the south side of the basilica. Such an unusually large number of vertical monuments strongly signaled the south facade of the basilica, richly animated by various decorative devices, and where two doors opened. It may be supposed that such an effect was linked to the very particular function attached to the sanctuary mentioned before. You remember I told that the basilica of Ererouyk is one of these very important sanctuaries we consider as memorial, and apart from that, is one of the very few in Armenia to have a double dedication. You remember it is consecrated to two very popular saints in Armenia, Saint John the Baptist and Saint Stephen, the precursor and the protomartyr. This double mention, which is mentioned in the inscription, suggests that the relics of these saints could very well be in the sanctuary, which would explain its strong attractiveness. Regarding the function of the lower part of these vertical monuments, a testimony of the historian of architecture and archaeologist Alexander Sahinian, related to the study he had conducted at the Basilica of Kassar in the late 40s, seemed to indicate that in addition to wearing stelas or columns, the pedestals could contain burials. That is what Sahinian thought and found in Kassar. The disturbances suffered by two pedestals among those that we have in Ererouyk made possible for us excavations in two of them, in two of these pedestals, in order to clarify their function. One of them, the number 5 that you see in front of you, one of them had already been visited. But the second one turned out to be uncorrupted. Our digging revealed, at least based on the investigation of this pedestal, revealed that these small stepped platforms served only as podiums for the stelas or columns standing on them. Being filled with compacted earth, they didn't, at least this one, did not contain any burials. As for the rest of what obviously corresponded to a memorial zone, excavations to the south and the southeast of the basilica have shown the presence of a cemetery. The vertical monuments, these pedestals, were erected obviously after the construction of the church, after the 6th century, and played an important role in the spatial organization of the memorial funerary zone, because, as excavations showed it, from the 8th century onwards, many tombs gathered around them, and especially before their west side. What you can see, I hope you can see on this this part. I don't know if you see my arrow here. On this part of the photo, you see the pedestals, and before them, from the west side, you see the graves, the tombs, certain number of tombs placed precisely before the west side of the monuments. This allowed us to date approximately to the 7th century the pedestals. You understand? The pedestals are, have been placed after the 6th century and before the tombs, which are dated to the 8th century. The factors that I mentioned before led us to focus on the cemetery in the area southeast of the basilica, where a certain layer of earth remains, while almost everywhere else the rock touches. As a result of our investigations, 72 tombs have been brought to light. Among them, 29 samples of human bones could be submitted to radiocarbon analysis and thus dated. They attest that the cemetery functioned since the late antique period until almost our days. During this long existence, the first phase could be identified with 5 tombs dated from the 3rd to 6th centuries. Among various useful data, it testifies to a human activity on the site, probably before the construction of the present basilica. The second sequence, the 6th, 8th centuries, is less represented, at least among the tombs we studied, since it concerns only 2 of them. On the contrary, the 8th, 11th centuries, with 12 tombs, correspond to an intense phase of activity. The last active phase covers the 11th, 12th centuries, with 4 individuals buried. Then begin low-intensity episodes between the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 12th century. During this last period, occasional burials were practiced, probably due to a rarefaction, then a disappearance of the population, or a gradual abandonment of the cemetery or of the locality. Throughout the existence of the cemetery, the funerary practices remained mainly the same, with the corpses laid on their back, the head to the west and the feet to the east, the arms generally folded to the chest. However, 2 may be noted, with a break between the 10th and 11th centuries. The first one concerns the containers. Until the 10th century, small stone plates placed vertically formed a box. It is what you can see on the picture from the left side. A box, first at the very beginning of the cemetery's history, rectangular, then trapezoidal, more narrow to the east. From the 11th century appears a more modest practice of burying the corpses directly in a grave dug in the earth. The second change concerns the recruiting. During the first period, until the 10th century, it corresponded to a normal parish population with women, men, and children. But in the second, from the 11th century, an absolute predominance of small babies is observed. Concerning the reason for such a change, one of the hypotheses is that a liturgical or dogmatic modification or a change in the church dedication made it possible to bury near the sanctuary small children who died before receiving the baptism. Indeed, as the inscription engraved inside the basilica seems to suggest, such a change, probably the restoration of the initial dedication to Saint John the Baptist and Saint Stephen, could have resulted in installing relics of these two saints in the church of Ererouyk. Presumably, the presence of such relics could constitute a kind of derogatory permission for the burial of very small unbaptized children. Here again you see the row of pedestals, the row of tombs before them. And again, we can note that the pedestals served as a reference pole, and the tombs were installed around them, and especially before them. We suppose that there was a sort of special area, perhaps dynastic, with a kind of private space for special tombs just before the monument, the pedestals, the steles. As part of the archaeological examination of the cemetery, the exhumed skeletons have been the subject of a detailed anthropological study. This revealed, among others, on two skulls dated between the 3rd and the 5th century, a curious practice, an intentional deformation by a treatment with bands tightening the cranial box imposed on the subjects since childhood. This practice was known in antique Armenia and Iran, but until our investigations in Ererouyk, it was not attested in the early Christian period. Furniture is rare in Christian tombs, at least in medieval Armenia. In Ererouyk, however, in one of the graves, we found a bronze belt buckle. Thanks to the bone under which it was placed, it could be dated to the 8th century. It should be noted that buckles of this type, discovered, for example, in Duin, have been attributed a later dating between 9th and 13th century. Thanks to the Ererouyk finding, we know now that such objects appeared earlier. Now let's have a look at the fence wall around the basilica. The first courses of a wall erected to the north and the east of the ecclesiastical zone belonged to a kind of false rampart. Another wall stood to the south of the cemetery and separated it from the inhabited area lying more to the south. This south wall is irregular and obviously strongly altered in the courses of the century, but against all expectations, it proved to be one of the oldest elements of this zone. Thanks to excavated tombs and thanks to stratigraphy, it can be dated, the south wall can be dated at least for its oldest part to the 3rd, 5th centuries. The northern and eastern walls are of another quality, much more regular, especially the eastern long wall, whose south extremity seems to have had a link with the upper part of the dam, which we will see after. This false rampart is punctuated by a series of external buttresses and, for the eastern wall, by 2 exedras. I have lost, yes, here you can see the east wall and the 2 exedras, and I have also another, yes, here, another picture when the exedras are shown. So these exedras were opened to the west, to the west of the interior of the ecclesial area, and there was also a door situated at the south extremity of the wall. The investigations tend to show that the eastern wall and its protruding structures resulted from a coherent architectural campaign. The absence of any trace of a 4th wall west of the basilica and the relative thinness of the stonework confirm that the ensemble did not form a complete, real rampart. These walls were probably not intended to protect the ensemble, but to delimitate the sacred area, and above all, to emphasize from outside, from the east, the importance of the ecclesial group. So here you can see the attempt of reconstruction made by my colleague Andreas Hartmann-Wernich. And here also some moments of his work on this eastern wall. Among the 2 exedras of this eastern wall, the northern one, opposite to the southeast corner of the basilica, had a deep pit under its floor, unfortunately already visited. These structures evoke the apse, or let's say the niche, the apse niche of a church. And they might have added to the false rampart a religious funerary function. The technical characteristics of these walls and some elements of decoration of these buttresses. I want to find again these pictures. Yes, here, this one, for example. Their technical characteristics create a certain kinship between them and the basilica. But in the same time, their orientation, and now I have to find the plan here, their orientation slightly different from that of the basilica in the absence of any topographical or physical justification, suggests that it may be prior to it. I mean, the walls prior to the basilica. This may be an additional indication that although there is no trace of any structure under the ground of the church, the site was already occupied before the construction of the basilica. Now let's go to the small building which is in the valley. This vaulted building, half buried in the small valley, to the northeast of the basilica and partly preserved, had been first studied by Felix Termartirosov and interpreted by him as a cistern. The poor state of conservation of this monument, especially its upper part and its vault and its roof, did not allow excavations because they could endanger the stability of the whole structure. For that reason, a digging was undertaken outside at a short distance from the eastern wall of the construction, in the hope to find elements allowing to better apprehend, if not its dating, at least its function. It revealed the presence of an accumulation of large blocks in the bottom of the valley, probably aimed at protecting the construction from the water of the seasonal torrent. This, together with the absence of any trace of waterproof plastering inside the building, seemed to contradict the cistern hypothesis, and, on the contrary, to strengthen the idea of a mausoleum. Both these functions were first envisaged by Felix Termartirosov. Indeed, the rectangular, very carefully vaulted building is oriented. Oriented, it means directed towards the east, you understand, but has no up at east and is almost deprived of primary openings. And thus it reminds some medieval Armenian mausoleums. A few architectural clues provide some approximative elements for dating. The technical and metrological characteristics of some parts of the interior wall covering seem to reflect a chronological proximity to the basilica. On the other hand, the sharpness of the saddleback roof, perhaps this picture and this one are better to understand what I'm talking about. The roof, you see, very sharp like this. And the vertical arrangement of the external cladding blocks on the upper part of west and east facades, added to the affinities with the mausoleums, argue in favor of a dating in the Middle Ages. From these arguments emerges the hypothesis of two stages in the architectural history of the building, one early Christian and the other one medieval. Now let's move to the southeast part of the site and have a look to the ensemble of parallel walls to the southeast of the basilica. So we have here a group of 3 or 4 parallel walls, once crossing the valley, for which the function of a dam was attested in the 19th century, according to a testimony collected by Nikolai Marr in the early 20th century. But the presence of rows or of steps and buttresses on the northern face of the walls. Here you see the south face. Now I will show you the north face. Here it is. The north faces of the walls. You understand, when we are talking about north face of walls, we talk of walls looking upstream, not downstream, but upstream. So, of course, this led us to the supposition that the function of this construction could have been different from the one first envisaged, the function of a dam, at least at certain periods, including a possible link with the eastern wall of the ecclesiastical ensemble. It might have had the function of a viaduct leading to the rampart from hypothetical remains of a road seemingly visible to the east of the site. I have to find the general here, it's here, the general plan. So the idea, you understand, the idea of a viaduct leading to the ensemble from the east, from the plateau, to the east of the ensemble. Our archaeological and geoarchaeological investigations conducted on different parts of this ensemble of walls led us to the supposition that the construction started probably at the late antique period from the south, probably with the intention of installing a dam of water retention. Indeed, an excavation carried out at the foot of the north side of the first south wall has revealed shards of antique pottery. The function of water retention dam seems to agree with the testimonies provided by the sources, by the inscriptions. They testify that in the Middle Ages, the village of Ererouyk was appreciated for the fertility of its land. It is likely that the irrigation made possible by the dam played an important role in the development of this activity, probably stimulated by the proximity of Ani, a densely populated city which became in 961 capital of Armenia. Then the addition of 2 parallel walls to the north and the filling of the intermediate spaces have given rise to the hypothesis of a prestigious viaduct leading to the basilica, combined to the dam function. It should be noted that these 2 walls successively added to the north, again I repeat, upstream, these walls by their neat and animated north face seemed to have also the function of enhancing the perspective directed towards the basilica. This feature is further reinforced by the angle that the third wall draws near the stream, turning clearly to the northwest. I don't know if you can understand what I am talking about here on the upper this upper picture to the left. You can see the angle which was given to the wall in order to convey to it an orientation towards the northwest. Yes. The dating of this set of walls is uncertain. The north face of the intermediate wall, uncovered by the mission, seems to give an indication on this subject. It's, let me put it again here. It is this one in the lower part and in the right part of the picture. It's high quality cladding, its pilasters, and the arrangement of the blocks and of the courses reflect a design and a technique close to those of the basilica. One can, as a simple hypothesis, propose an antique or late antique origin for the first south wall, then attribute to the early Christian period the intermediate wall, and roughly locate in the Middle Ages the second enlargement with the third wall. And finally, let's have a look at the sculpted stones. More than 200 remains of sculpted or molded stones are present on the site. Most of them have been gathered on the rock platform not north of the basilica. Many of these stones belong to major architectural forms, mainly to the basilica itself. For example, fragments of columns or capitals from its galleries. The others come from smaller forms of the memorial sphere, such as stelas. One of them is a fragment of a stela whose four sides are covered with eroded images of saints and angels. There are also dozens of tombstones, which belong to a type prevalent in medieval Armenia, with a characteristic shape of a saddleback on a parallelepiped base. Today, almost all have been moved north of the basilica, but originally these stones served as surface markers for burials dug in the ground a few dozen centimeters lower. The size of each stone corresponded roughly to that of the tomb, and therefore to the age of the deceased. The flatter ones, whose shape approaches that of a sarcophagus lids, seem to be the oldest. On the contrary, those closer to the Middle Ages have a more higher volume and a steeper inclination of the slopes. And now let's conclude. Thanks to the investigations carried out by the French Armenian mission of our laboratory, in Ererouyk, important results, which I tried to briefly describe above, have been recorded. Some options exposed in my introduction could be elucidated. Our knowledge of the Ererouyk basilica has been improved, as well as that of various components of the site. We understood that the attractiveness of the Ererouyk ensemble was probably quite strong and probably related to the presence of relics. And I suppose that we can imagine this large church of Ererouyk as a popular place of pilgrimage, frequented, of course, by the local population, but perhaps also by Syrians. As you understand, of course, the many enigmas posed by Ererouyk site are far from having been fully solved. And thus, the questions that remain to be elucidated will provide an abundant material for future missions that will focus on the study of this remarkable site. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Donabédian, thank you very much for your interesting speech. We learned really a lot of new facts about the site, and we hope that in the future, with the project approved by the government of Republic of Armenia, we will be able to take better care about this site, and also to revitalize the importance of it. So before going to the discussion, I'd like to invite Mr. Haik Mkrtchyan, the representative of the Ministry of Education, Science, Culture and Sports of Armenia to deliver a talk about in behalf of the Deputy Minister, Mrs. Narine Khachaturian. Mr. Mkrtchyan, you can talk. Thank you.
Hello. Hello.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank everyone for this very important and very interesting presentation, and especially to Professor Donabédian. This was very interesting, and I thought that I kept my breath until the end of the presentation. So very thank you, and on behalf of everyone, actually, our auditorium, and actually as a representative from a Ministry of Education, Science, Culture and Sport, and assistant to our Deputy Minister, Ms. Narine Khachaturian. So I would like to thank you for this initiative and for all your hard work that you have done during this decades, and hopefully you will still continue to do that. And as Gayane mentioned, government initiated very important step to preserve and actually to reevaluate, towards the valorization, as you said, of the very important monument in Armenia. And as Ms. Narine Khachaturian, I want to say that since now, actually, we have to consolidate all our efforts and to work towards the better and more stable preservation and management of our historic and heritage sites. So, and just a couple of comments and maybe a little bit also surprise regarding also to Ererouyk. So not surprised, but actually ministry is now discussing the possibility of nominating Ererouyk as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but we will be in touch regarding this with the experts of the field. So but what we would like you to know that since now, actually, you know, we have to pay more attention and more effort towards this, I think, big goal for everyone, and to have initially included Ererouyk also as a UNESCO heritage site in the list of many other universal value monuments around the world. So this is all maybe what Ms. Narine Khachaturian would like to add, and we don't want to bother the auditorium because people have maybe questions and comments regarding your presentation. Thank you again, and good luck to all of us for this great future collaboration. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mukarchian. I would like to open the discussion, and here we have a question to Professor Donabédian from Paolo Vitti. I'd like to read it. In your reconstruction, it seems that the bigger windows were opened into the side porticos. How you explain this solution, which shows to limit very much the amount of light entering inside the church? More in general, which was the approach to illumination of the interior of these 5th, 6th century churches? This is the question from Paolo Vitti. Professor, could you please answer to it? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. A very important one. In general, the question of the galleries of the basilica is a complicated one, is a complex one. And as you understand, the attempt of reconstruction, which I showed, was just a proposal. We are not sure at all that this is the true aspect of these structures which they had initially. But of course, in the first step, in the first phase of the history of the monument, probably there were such galleries. I guess that they disappeared very early. There was a collapse of these structures because they were very weak. They were very weak. As I told you, the pilasters didn't play any role in supporting these structures, and it is quite strange in such a country as Armenia, where the earthquakes are frequent and very strong. It is quite strange, very difficult to imagine how such galleries could have been leaned against the facades, almost again without any constructive link. This is very strange. And what about their disposal with regard to the windows and the penetration of light inside the basilica? It is also difficult to answer because, as I told previously, our hypothesis is still very like this, just a proposal. We don't know exactly where the columns were placed and to what extent they impeded, they didn't allow the light to penetrate inside the church. In general, the question of lightning in medieval, in early Christian and medieval architecture is very important. As probably many of you know, there was an evolution in the beginning, especially in the 7th century, during the golden age of the 7th century. The windows were large, were wide, and provided a generous lighting to the interiors of the churches. And after the Arab domination, during the period of the kingdoms, from the end of the 9th century, the windows in Armenia became very narrow from outside and widening inside. So there is such a change in the first period, in the very early Christian period. We have both narrow and wide windows. This question still has to be investigated.
Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome.
We have a number of questions and comments, especially many participants. Thank you for sharing your research.
Pleasure.
And they enjoyed it. But now the second question, I would like Gayane Kaznati to answer to it. But there are also some questions addressed to you, Professor. So now question for Gayane Kaznati. Thank you for sharing your researches. This is about you, Professor.
You're welcome.
It's a great honor to have a scientist in Armenology like you. I want to know, are you involved in a reconstruction and protection works of Ererouyk Basilica, which will start soon? Because Ghana is curating all the procedures, so I would like, in partnership with ROCHEMP, I'd like to ask her to answer to this question.
Thank you for these questions. Thank you, Professor Donabédian, for this inspiring conference. As concerns the studies for the preservation of the monuments, since a few years has already been set a scientific committee that will supervise each step of the preservation of the monument. Of course, Professor Donabédian is part of this scientific committee. He's the most important member of it because, we all share the thought that the most important thing, the most important element to allow a good preservation work is a good knowledge of the monuments we are preserving. So his studies are really, really very important also in this regard. So thank you again for all the work he has done. And thank you for the questions.
Okay, thank you. We go to the next question from David Kertmejan. Is it possible to pass some parallels with Rusafa and Zenobia Halabia in Syria? Yet I am not talking about antique villages excavated by George Chalenko and Butler, etc. Thank you for the nice work done. Do you want me to read the question again?
Yes, please. I didn't understand the beginning.
Okay. Is it possible to pass some parallels with Rusafa and Zenobia Halabia in Syria?
Yes, thank you. I have to look once again to look at these monuments to be able to answer the question correctly. But in general, there are many parallels between Ererouyk and Tekor from one side and the Syrian monuments from the other side. It is obvious that there is a very narrow kinship between them, but in the same time, a lot of differences. these Armenian monuments, ERERUYK and Tekor, belong to another sphere, to another world, to another tradition. It is close, but very different from Syrian architecture. First, technique is quite different. You know that in Syria, yeah, they used big, large blocks, continuing the antique tradition, and in Armenia mainly we use the combined technique with concrete, with the concrete inside the wall, and pavements and exterior blocks on the facades. Then I mentioned, for example, the specificity of the eastern chambers, which are very narrow in Armenia. It is very interesting to see that that in Tekor, in Etchmiadzin, in Divin, as well as in Ererouyk, we find the same kind of elongated and narrow fastophoria in the eastern part of the church. And of course, they resemble, to a certain extent, they resemble the Syrian monuments, but they are also different simultaneously. And the decoration also is quite different. As a matter of fact, for example, in some books, one can find the opinion that the portals of early Christian Armenia are borrowed from Syrian forms. This is completely wrong, and Ererouyk shows it very clearly. The portals in Ererouyk and in all the other early Christian Armenian churches are directly linked with the Syrian, with the Roman tradition, without passing through the Syrian intermediary, directly from the Roman source. David posed a question related to precise monuments. Unfortunately, I don't remember. I have to look at the monuments precisely to be able to answer correctly.
Okay, thank you, Professor. The next question that I'm going to read, I guess you have already answered a part of it, but still I'm going to read it. Hello, well, this question is from Ben Stuberg. He writes, hello, thank you for this educational presentation. I would like to ask a question. Although they are so close to each other, while the architectural features on the Ani site generally carry the Georgian architectural features, why do we see the effects of Syrian architecture in Ererouyk? Does it have any related with the rulerships that rule the regions?
Once again, the part concerning Georgian link.
Yeah, okay.
I didn't get it.
Although it says, although they are so close to each other,
Yes.
while the architectural features on the Ani site generally carry the
On the Ani what? On the Ani what?
Site
Yes.
maybe. Yeah, site.
Yes.
Ani site, archaeological site, generally carry the Georgian architectural features. Why do we see the effects of Syrian architecture in Ererouyk?
Thank you. Yes, it's a good question. Thank you for the question. Let's start from Ererouyk and then we will go to Ani. In Ererouyk, we have, as you saw, many common elements with Syria, it is obvious. And of course, the reason is that the links were very strong between these Eastern Christian communities in Syria and in Armenia, and Syria was radiating, culture, very rich tradition, which exerted a certain influence on the whole region, including Armenia, of course. This is probably the reason why we find these common features, but simultaneously, as I told previously, Ererouyk and all the Armenian monuments are quite different, and they belong to the Armenian tradition, which is already well established at the beginning and which will reach its zenith, the first zenith during the 7th century, during what I call the Golden Age. Now, as for Ani, I suppose that our colleague is talking about the monuments of the 13th century. In 13th century Armenia, it is true that we find many elements which are common between Armenian and Georgian architectures, some of them being borrowed from Georgian tradition and used on monuments built by Chalcedonian Armenians, by Armenians who belonged to the Orthodox church, to the church to which Georgia also belonged, to the branch of the church to which they belong. And so in the group, in this very interesting group of Chalcedonian monuments of the north of Armenia, you find really elements taken from the Georgian tradition, and it is natural because these communities belong to the same family, confessional family. Now, if we go precisely to Ani in this period, the 13th century, because before the 13th century, honestly, there's nothing, no trace of any Georgian link, no influence in Ani. This question may be discussed only since the end of the 12th century. So in Ani, what do we have? In Ani, we have very rich architecture, very open to the outer world, especially the Muslim world. But it is strange to see that the links leading to Georgia are quite few in Ani. The only thing we can mention on this subject is the so-called Georgian church, which is not very Georgian. In fact, if we take its architectural and decorative characteristics, and the only Georgian element is the large inscription in Georgian language that was engraved on the church, and which has disappeared, unfortunately. But we have the text, of course, and which shows that it was in 1218. It was consecrated by the Georgian Catholicos. And that's all. And also in Ani, we have, of course, the famous church of Saint Gregory, built by the very rich merchant Tigran Honens in 1215. And in this church, one can find beautiful wall paintings with Georgian and Greek inscriptions. perhaps, as some art historians suppose, perhaps made by Georgian artists, although many others do not share this hypothesis. But if we take the architecture and the sculpted decoration of this church, it is a pure representant of the Armenian tradition, and especially the Ani, the tradition of the royal architecture of the capital of Armenia.
Thank you for your answer. I think that was really very interesting to see all these parallels, and all these questions are really concerning and actual the regional architecture. So I think you made really peace in some point.
You're welcome.
So the next question is from Hovannes Nazaretian. Professor Donabédian, what are your views about the theory that at least some parts of basilica were built in the pre-Christian period? Your investigations seem to disprove the existence of an older structure, but could the structure itself have been built before the early 4th century? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. It is an important one. As I told in my lecture, it is a very widely accepted vision that almost all the oldest Armenian churches must have a pre-Christian layer, pre-Christian origin. It is a dogma almost in Armenia, and it is logical. As everywhere in the world, a sanctuary doesn't appear like this without any ground. So, but in the case of Ererouyk, our investigations, and not only our investigation, but also the soundings, the sondage made by Italian archaeologists before us, seem to show that there is nothing under the ground, under the walls of the basilica. So we have what we have. We have this this evidence, the evidence of the results of our diggings, our excavations. We didn't find anything under the walls of the basilica in its main part, under the apse, and also in the southwestern angle. The southwest angle is important from this point of view because the floor of this chamber is lower, is significantly lower than the floor of the main nave of the church. So one could have expected that it would be possible to find something very old there when digging under the floor of this chamber. But what we found is that there was nothing. There was the rock under the floor, the double floor that we discovered. So that's what we have now in Ererouyk.
Well, thank you very much for your answer. Next question is from Svetlana Donabédian.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I have a question. Is there another archaeological site, other churches, in the territory of Armenia, which is famous for its children's burials like Ererouyk?
Famous for the children burials?
Yes.
No, for a very simple reason. As I said in my presentation, it is a domain which is very little studied in Armenia. In general, medieval, early Christian and medieval archaeology is not developed yet in Armenia, and especially funerary archaeology. Funerary archaeology is kind of taboo in Armenia because you understand we are dealing with Christian tombs. So to a certain extent, tombs of our or your ancestors. And that's probably the reason why people do not like very much to excavate tombs, to dig cemeteries in medieval and early Christian Armenia among the Armenian archaeologists. But the situation is changing, and we have young colleagues in the Institute of Archaeology of the Armenian Academy of Sciences who have started to study this area, and some very interesting publications have already appeared, and I hope that we will have more information very soon in the near future. But for the moment, we do not know of another site with such a cemetery, such an enigma with many tombs where very small babies are buried. Using the opportunity given me by Svetlana, I would like to draw your attention to the first photo I showed from the cemetery. It was very touching for us when we opened this grave. Perhaps you remember the photo I will show you again after. We discovered that there was an adult which was laid according to the rules on the back, as always, but on the right side of this adult there was a child which was laid on his side, not on the back, and it was obvious that the child was very close to the adult. The child, our anthropologist, was able to date the bones to generally this grave is very old, and the age of the baby of the child was estimated by our anthropologist around 8-9 years old. So it was very touching to see, because it is a double. This is a very rare phenomenon when you have a double burial with two individuals simultaneously. Sometimes you have reductions and many new bones found in the same grave. But here you have two individuals who were simultaneously buried together. So it is not difficult to imagine a father, or I don't remember, it was a lady or a man, but let's say a father or a mother and his or her daughter or son in the same grave.
Thank you. It's really very interesting, also about the mentality of family-based societies and so on. It's another topic of discussion, I guess. Well, I want to read the last question from Gevorg Hrimian. Thank you for the fascinating talk. Can you speak about the roof of Ererouyk Basilica in regards to vaulting, tiles, and so on?
The look,
the roof.
The look and after?
No. Could you please tell us about the roof?
The roof?
Yes, of the basilica.
Oh, this is a very difficult question. If we are talking about the the structure under the roof, it is complicated. For the roof, for the covering of the roof, we have found many remains, many shards of tiles. There were a lot of tiles in the south area where is located the cemetery. Tiles that were used to cover the roof, the roofs, obviously, and this was not surprising for us because we knew that in Armenia during the first centuries, the first Christian centuries, until the 7th century inclusively, the roofs were covered with tiles. With ceramic tiles, and we have some examples now preserved or remade in, for example, in Ashtarak or let's say in Oshakan, and we have old examples of such tiles in Mren, from the other side of the border in Turkey. You have still probably from the 7th century tiles in Mren, and then you know that after the revival, after the Arab domination, the tiles almost disappeared in Armenia and were replaced by stone plates, which gave to the Armenian domes their characteristic, you know, conical or let's say the well-known form of the Armenian domes. So in Ererouyk we had tiles on the roof. And the general form, I think, was the one which I tried to present in my reconstruction. With one common two slopes roof on the main nave, and two single pent roofs on the lateral naves, and continuing above the galleries. That's what I presented.
It's really interesting. Unfortunately, our time for Zoom is coming to the end in 7 minutes. I have received one more question. If it's possible to answer in brief, and then we will close the webinar.
Okay, I will try.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I cannot read the name of the writer, so I will read the question. How the place for basilica as a memorial monument was chosen? Are there any legend or hypotheses as we have in the case of Zvartnots?
No, thank you for the good question. No, unfortunately, there's no tradition, no story linked with this site, and even nothing in the sources, except for the inscriptions that I mentioned. How it was chosen, we do not know exactly. We understood that there was something in the site before the construction of the basilica. It is obvious. The walls are probably older. There are tombs that are older than the basilica. This means that there was something, but what was the reason of this choice for this type of sanctuary? Still, for the meanwhile, we don't know, unfortunately, or fortunately, because it means that we still have to continue our investigations.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome.
For your nice presentation and for your inspiring answers. I'm sure that in the future we will have more possibilities to talk to you and to learn more from you about this site also. And before giving the final talk to Gayane Gaznati, I would like to thank all participants for being with us during these 2 hours of the webinar, and to invite them to follow our the pages of ROCHEMP Center and also the website of the ROCHEMP Center, because in the future we are going to present very interesting and important scientific, theoretical and practical materials for the professionals of the cultural heritage management, enhancement and protection field. Dear Gayane, I would like to ask you for a final speech, and in 4 minutes we will all leave the webinar. Thank you all and wish you a nice evening.
Okay, thank you, dear Annie. Thank you to all the audience, and to Annie Avakian and to all the ROCHEMP staff that organized very well this webinar. Of course, thank you very much again to Patrick Donabédian for this very inspiring conversation. We hope we will have other occasion to go more in depth about Ererouyk Basilica, that is really charming also for its enigmas. And well, what I would like to say is that Professor Donabédian wrote a very beautiful book about Ererouyk Basilica and its archaeological site. This book will be printed soon by Printinfo for, well, I don't remember the name of the editor.
Sarkis Khachents.
Okay, Sarkis Khachents, sorry. So if somebody is interested for this book, they can ask to Printinfo or to ROCHEMP for having a preview, or is possible also to print to book the book, let's say. So thank you to all, and let's hope to see you all again each other in these webinars that ROCHEMP will keep organizing in the future. Thank you, Annie, again.
Thank you, and thanks also to the participants who sent to Professor and to us very interesting questions by kind of making the discussion more interesting and interactive. Thank you and see you soon. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Bye.